In this episode, a killer whale becomes a killer. After years of psychological and physical abuse in captivity, Tilikum turns on his trainer, a young, enthusiastic marine biology student whose final words were, "I don't want to die." Hit like and subscribe. This is fierce. Filikum was an orca. He was made famous by the documentary Blackfish, which details the life of captive orcas. It's an incredibly sad and moving insight into the terrible conditions these magnificent animals are subjected to. Tilikum was just 2 years old when he was ripped away from his family in the wild. He was separated from his mother and towed behind a boat towards Canadian shores to begin a life in captivity. Once he arrived at Canada's coastline, he was transferred into a tank at Sealand, Victoria, British Columbia. It was there, in a tiny pool, where he was made to perform mindless tricks in front of a fascinated crowd, day in and day out. Orcas are thought to be one of the most intelligent animals on Earth. They have highly complex social interactions with other individuals, both within their pod and from outside it. Typically, wild orcas spend their entire lives with their mothers, and pods can be made up of 4 generations. They form friendships and lifelong bonds with each other. They help other individuals when they're sick or injured, and they can display a range of emotions. Being held in captivity is one of the harshest forms of animal cruelty when it comes to orcas. Tilikum had no variation in his daily routine at Sealand. There was little or no mental stimulation for him. Not only that, but he was also placed in a pool with 2 older, dominant females who would bully him. They raked him with their teeth, causing him to bleed. They bashed into him to assert their dominance, and inside such a small pool, there was nowhere for Tilikum to go. It was the start of a life of misery for the young killer whale. Keltie Byrne was a marine biology student who was enthusiastic and eager to learn. During her spare time, she worked at Canada's Sealand. It was a way for her to earn extra money to help fund her studies, and was an environment in which she could put her learning into practice. Working with Tilikum and the other orcas at Sealand was a rewarding and physically demanding job. Working as an animal trainer, Keltie knew the importance of building a rapport with the animals she worked with. Being assigned to train the orcas was an exciting opportunity, but she had no idea that her part-time job would one day cost her her life. That tragic day was February 20th, 1991. The enthusiastic 20-year-old had just finished a successful show with Tilikum and the 2 females. The packed audience had lapped it up, marveling at the speed, agility, and power of the orcas as they performed in the pool in front of them. When the audience started to file out of the area at the end of the show, Keltie began tidying up. She walked around the edge of the water, scooping out the various toys and floating objects from the surface of the pool with a net. But suddenly, she slipped and fell into the water. She was a strong swimmer and went to pull herself out onto the side when she felt a sharp tug on her foot. She looked down and noticed that Tilikum had hold of her foot in his mouth. Keltie let out a panicked cry as the killer whale pulled her backwards and dragged her underwater. The 3 whales had never had anyone in their pool before. It wasn't part of their routine. The only toys they had been allowed to play with were small plastic ones that they were commanded to push around the water to entertain the crowd. This was a new experience for them. It turned out to be a deadly experience. Beneath the surface, Keltie fought for air, but Tilikum pulled her to the bottom of the pool and refused to let go. He tugged her along effortlessly. She was tiny in comparison to his huge frame. He could have ripped her to shreds then and there, but instead he wanted to have some fun. Keltie's lungs felt like they were going to burst. She could see the surface of the pool above her. It was so far away she didn't know if she could hold on much longer. But then, momentarily, Tilikum released his grip on the young student and she swam to the surface. Gasping for air, she made a mad dash for the side of the pool. But the 3 orcas weren't finished with her yet. They were excited by this new plaything in the water. They had never had anything in the pool before that was so interactive. They were fixated on Keltie as they pushed her around and bumped into her over and over. They bit down on her, causing her to cry out in pain. When Keltie was just feet from the safety of dry land, they grabbed her once more and pulled her backwards. Horrified onlookers heard her cry out, "I don't want to die," as she was dragged underwater again. Staff rushed to the pool. There wasn't a specific safety protocol for this kind of event. It had never happened before, and trainers weren't allowed in the water with the whales at that time. They threw fish into the water in an attempt to get them to release Keltie. They hit a bucket on the side of the pool and slapped the surface of the water to try to distract the orcas. But it didn't work. They shouted their recall commands, but none of them responded. Fellow trainer Karen McGee threw a life ring toward Keltie as she resurfaced once again. Keltie made a desperate grab for it, but the orcas kept her away. The youngster screamed out Karen's name, begging her to help, but Tilikum and the two females, Nootka and Haida, kept her from grabbing hold of the floating buoy. They knew what they were doing. They knew she was in distress, and still they kept dragging her underwater and pulling her around their pool like a plaything. She was at their mercy. With the orcas weighing in excess of 6 tons, the young competitive swimmer was no match for them as they tugged at her again and again. When Keltie resurfaced a third time, she no longer moved. To the shock of her colleagues, it was clear that she was dead, drowned by 3 captive orcas. She had been stripped of her clothes and floated on the surface, covered in bites and bruises. She was the first person to be killed by a captive killer whale in history. It sent shockwaves across the world. It took 2 more hours before staff at Sealand could retrieve Keltie's body from the water. It was incredibly traumatic for staff and emergency responders to watch the orcas drag the body of their deceased colleague around the pool. But the orcas played tirelessly with her until eventually they released her and allowed staff to scoop her out with a huge net. She had drowned just feet from the edge of the pool and in front of her friends and colleagues who were powerless to help. It had been a terrible mistake, but it had been one that could have been avoided. Paul Spong, director of Orca Lab who researches orcas, said that the incident was waiting to happen. If you pen a wild killer whale and deprive them of almost all mental and sensory stimulation, they are going to become psychologically damaged. The same can be said for humans treated in a similar way. Nobody could blame the whales for Keltie's tragic death. The incident had been years in the making, following a decade of mistreatment. Only a year later, Sealand closed down. It never recovered from the terrible death of Keltie, and serious questions were raised about the ethics of keeping orcas in captivity. Tilikum, Nootka, and Haida were rehomed. Filikum was transferred to Orlando SeaWorld, where his captive conditions were significantly improved. But it was too late. The psychological damage had already been done to the now fully grown orca, and in time, he would strike again and again. Dawn Brancheau made up her mind when she was 10 years old, back when she was still Dawn Therese Loverde, and her parents took her to SeaWorld in California. She'd known right then and there what she wanted to be when she grew up. Seeing Shamu, the world's most famous orca, perform one of the routines at SeaWorld was enough to convince the little girl. She wanted to work with animals. Even better, she wanted to work with orcas, infamously known to the world as killer whales. There are no other animals like orcas, quite literally. While orcas belong to the oceanic dolphin family, they are also the only species in the genus Orcanus. They are among some of the most recognizable sea creatures with their sleek-looking black and white patterned bodies and their dorsal fins. Despite their cute looks, make no mistake, they are apex predators, unrivaled in their natural habitat. Orcas feed on fish, seals, and other species of dolphins. They don't normally see humans as prey, but this doesn't mean our interaction with the species is as limited as it should be. Some populations of orcas are considered threatened or endangered due to marine mammal parks, such as SeaWorld, among other things. And as Dawn Brancheau's story shows, it took a human tragedy for marine mammal parks to adjust their practices and their treatment of the spectacular creatures. The woman first spent 2 years working with dolphins at Six Flags in New Jersey. It wasn't until 1994 that she began her career at SeaWorld Orlando, where she started out as a trainer by working with otters and sea lions. 2 years later, in 1996, Dawn married Scott Brancheau, and she started working with orcas. Her childhood dream was finally true. Dawn Brancheau worked hard for her dream, even when she had it in the palm of her hand. She knew working with orcas was dangerous, though attacks in captivity are very rare. In order to maintain her safety, Brancheau had to be fit. As a result, the trainer ran marathons, lifted weights, and cycled to stay in good shape. By the time she became a senior trainer, Brancheau was already well known. She took part in multiple SeaWorld public performances, essentially becoming the face of SeaWorld. Billboards throughout Orlando showed Dawn Brancheau performing with her beloved orcas. Her shows attracted the public like no others. The various stunts she would perform alongside the mighty animals delighted the young and the old alike. In 2010, Dawn Brancheau was already established as one of the world's most famous orca trainers. At 40 years old, Brancheau was still as dedicated to her work as ever. Seeing the 5'1" woman getting massive orcas to obey her was impressive, and the public relished in her shows. One of the most popular shows offered by SeaWorld in 2010 was called Dining with Shamu. The concept was simple. Visitors enjoyed a meal while being entertained by an orca training performance. After the show, visitors could also go to the viewing area and snap some photos of the orcas. While the original Shamu had died in 1971, SeaWorld trademarked the name and used it for various shows. Even more, several of the park's orcas have been given the name over the years. On the afternoon of February 24, 2010, Dawn Brancheau was set to perform a Dine with Shamu show. Her co-worker for the day was Tilikum Shamu, a 27-year-old male orca who weighed around 12,000 pounds and measured 23 feet. Brancheau had performed with Tilikum plenty of times before, and the two of them were quite close, despite the orca's past history of aggression towards humans. In 1991, when Tilikum was already 8 years into captivity, he and 2 other orcas drowned a trainer at Sealand of the Pacific in Vancouver. In 1991, he made another victim. A man who trespassed in SeaWorld after hours was found dead, lying across Tilikum's back. But Brancheau and the killer whale had developed what was called a close bond over the years. According to John Hargrove, a senior trainer at SeaWorld, Tilikum had a great relationship with her, and she had a great relationship with him. Even more, Tilikum seemed to love Brancheau, and Brancheau most certainly did love the whale. But it was all about to change on February 24, 2010. The show went well at first. Tilikum was obedient, performing all the stunts the way he was supposed to. Brancheau was not alone with the whale. The practice was for each trainer to have at least a spotter, a trainer who would ring an alarm and throw a rope or net into the tank if a trainer were to be attacked by a whale. On that Wednesday, Brancheau worked alongside 2 spotters, Jan Topoleski and Lynn Shaber. The show went well, and soon enough it was over. After the stunts, Brancheau usually had a bonding session with the orcas, just before visitors could come and take pictures of the animals. And it was during the bonding session that it all went horribly, horribly wrong. The 40-year-old was interacting with the orca nose to nose, and then something happened, something that terrified the audience. From where Jan Topoleski was standing, it seemed like Dawn Brancheau's long hair floated on the water directly in Tilikum's mouth. Brancheau struggled to free her hair from the orca's mouth, but Tilikum was known to be possessive. He disliked letting go of his toys. While Topoleski and others saw the whale getting a hold of Brancheau's hair, other witnesses claimed the orca had actually grabbed the woman by the arm. No matter which one of these was correct, there was no doubt about what happened next. Tilikum pulled Brancheau into the pool, submerging the woman underwater. They struggled for a bit. The orca swung the woman in his mouth. Seconds later, Brancheau was seen trying to swim towards the surface. Tilikum retaliated. He struck Brancheau, but the woman persisted. Once again, the orca struck Brancheau. Then he immediately began swimming underwater with Brancheau in his mouth. The animal was agitated, swimming erratically. Staff tried to ask for control by slapping the water, but Tilikum seemed to have forgotten his training. Instead of obeying, he thrashed violently, becoming more and more agitated. Finally, 30 minutes later after Tilikum had begun his attack, several SeaWorld employees were able to redirect the orca into a smaller pool. Tilikum still didn't want to release Brancheau's now lifeless body, but this smaller pool was suited with a very useful addition, a hydraulic base. The bottom of the pool could be raised, which essentially beached the animal. Staff members then used a net to extract Dawn Brancheau from Tilikum's mouth. Brancheau had suffered horrible injuries. Her spinal cord had been severed in the attack, and she had been scalped. Tilikum kept attempting to get Brancheau's body even after she was removed from the water. When her body was placed 5 feet away from the pool, Tilikum kept lifting himself above the pool wall as if he was trying to reach Brancheau. Brancheau died of drowning and traumatic injuries. Her death was ruled an accident. As a direct result of the tragedy, SeaWorld was faced with the need to change its protocol. SeaWorld trainers no longer entered a pool to perform a show following Brancheau's death. OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, fined the park in August 2010 for 3 safety violations, citing the company willfully put its staff at risk. SeaWorld filed a series of appeals in order to receive permission to return to water performances, but a special Labor Department commission declined to hear the case in 2012. In 2016, following public backlash, SeaWorld stopped breeding captive orcas. The company pledged to focus on conservation and rehabilitation of the orcas in their care. Orcas are not pets. They are not performers. They are wild animals that deserve their freedom.